Welcome everybody to the Scottish University Press Fireside Chat, which marks the publication of our fourth book, Democratising Spy Watching, Public Oversight of Intelligence-Driven Surveillance in Southern Africa. I'm Hannah Whaley. I'm chair of the SUP Management Board. I'm also Director of Library and Academic Services at the University of Dundee. And I'm joined today by Gillian Daly, who is the Scottish University's Press Manager and also Executive Officer of the Scottish Confederation of University and Research Libraries. Scottish Universities Press, or SUP as you might hear us shorten it to, is a fully open access and not-for-profit press. The model provides a really clear and cost-effective route for researchers to make their work freely available to a global audience, which extends the impact of research across society. It's been developed by 20 university libraries working together through SCURL. We're excited to support the launch of this latest SUP book, which is available now openly and free to download in EPUB and PDF formats from sup.ac.uk. It's also available in print formats too. Now, whilst there's a lot of activity across libraries that goes into making SUP successful, it is of course our academic colleagues who are writing books and giving time to editorial board and peer review. And we're very grateful to authors who choose SUP and pleased to see their work reach publication day and make its way into the world, which is the case for the book we are discussing today. It's out now. So I'm very pleased to welcome the editors of Democratising Spy Watching, Public Oversight of Intelligence-Driven Surveillance in Southern Africa. We have Jane Duncan, Professor of Digital Society at the University of Glasgow, and Alan Munoriyarwa, Senior Research Associate at the University of Johannesburg. Democratising Spy Watching emerged through a British Academy Global Professorship. It explores public oversight of intelligence-driven digital surveillance in 8 Southern African countries. Essentially, it's asking what role citizens can play in ensuring accountability against this backdrop of rapid and far-reaching technological advancement. I'm wondering if we could start our conversation today with you telling us a bit of background to the book and what drew you to this area of research in the first place. I'll open up to both Jane and Alan.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you very much for the opportunity to publish with Scottish Universities Press. This is actually an area of work that we've been involved in for a number of years, and we go back to about 2014, where we started doing baseline mapping of the state of the surveillance state, if you like, in South Africa. And this was in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations, and from about 2015 onwards, we saw huge controversies about intelligence and surveillance overreach in many countries in the global north. But we had a sense, but we weren't quite sure that the problem was as bad, if not worse, in African countries. So given that I was based in South Africa, we just started to map the extent of surveillance capabilities, their oversight, the adequacy of their oversight, using a set of principles that had been developed to, I think, push back against unwarranted communication surveillance by global NGOs called the Necessary and Proportionate Principles. And then gradually the team extended. Alan became involved and other senior students and researchers and investigative journalists became involved, and we moved the research out into the Southern African region. And that's really the genesis of this research project. And then out of that, we decided to apply for a British Academy Global Professorship, which was successful, and we selected 8 researchers in various Southern African countries in order to focus on one specific element that we hadn't really done justice to up to that point, which was we were aware of the fact through our baseline research that existing oversight mechanisms, formal oversight mechanisms, parliaments, for instance, ombuds offices or inspectors general for intelligence were often not well resourced or were in more extreme cases set up for failure when it came to performing their oversight function. And we also started noticing that the public increasingly was compensating for these deficiencies. So we wanted to have a research project that looked at public oversight as a neglected form of oversight, an under-researched form of oversight. And we wanted to look at what worked and what didn't when it came to this form of oversight.
That's really helpful to hear and understand that how that work formed and how it began to shape and move towards the kind of key research point. Alan, did you want to add anything in at this stage?
First of all, well, thank you very much for inviting us to the chat. Maybe just a point to add to what Jane has already said. One thing that we noticed as the project expanded from maybe when I joined in 2018 is that the journalists that we were working with across the region were very passionate about the project. And as a result, they also started to disclose specific revelations that were very important. And I think the revelations of surveillance, those investigative pieces that we're trying to gather as part of this baseline research that Jane has already spoken about, they actually strengthened our resolve that there was a lot that was still needed to be researched. And I think that's how we also became to be where we are now.
Thank you. And I'm wondering from what you've said there, whether it was important to you particularly to make this work open access at the point of publishing.
Yes, I think it is very important because in my view, works on surveillance oversight globally are still very much emerging, especially considering the fact that most of the oversight mechanisms seem to be failing or are ignored at all. And in this sub-Saharan African region, oversight is still a term that the political elites are to get used to. So I think we have groundbreaking research here. It is very foundational to any discussions, everyday discussions around intelligence oversight. And for that reason, it is important to make it all open access because it gives future researchers capabilities to have somewhere to fall back on. So I think it is very important right from the day of publication to make this work available to almost everyone. And also it is important because for a book of this kind, the reach should be expanded. And there is very little reach that happens if it is hidden behind a paywall. So I think for those reasons, it's important to have it as open access.
That makes sense to me, that idea, saying it being sort of foundational, that then by widening access to it, you're making sure that conversations and additional work that carries on is able to use it as that foundation base for other pieces of work. So it has that greater reach in that way. I wonder why Scottish Universities Press for you? What was the motivation behind choosing SUP?
Well, I think that the fact that the University of Glasgow was hosting my global professorship was quite important to this. In fact, I was introduced to SUP through the University of Glasgow library, and I became aware of the fact that because the library was part of the consortium that you spoke about earlier, it was possible for the library to cover certain fees associated with the publication of the edited volume, including and perhaps most importantly the open access fee, which is no small amount of money, but it was that for us was very important. But I think at a more substantial level, it's very unusual and very heartening to see such a large group of universities collaborating in order to make knowledge, academic knowledge, publicly accessible. For one thing, it's very difficult for universities to set up and run their own academic presses. Many struggle financially, and they struggle with the dual tension of producing, academic knowledge in the public interest on the one hand and remaining financially viable on the other. So it made absolute sense for a group of organizations to collaborate in order to spread risks but pool resources at the same time. And it was heartening to see so many universities collaborating rather than competing on advancing academic knowledge. So all of those things put together, I think, made SUP a very attractive publishing proposition for us. And it's been a pleasure, in fact, working with your press.
Oh, Jane, I think you've touched exactly on our thoughts in terms of library-led and library-supported publishing, where there is both a financial and a practical aspect to it, but libraries feel well placed to be in there, making sure that we're lowering costs and bringing a transparency to that process and to the sort of administration around there, but also really genuinely interested in getting research out to a wider audience and supporting the impact of research in that way. I'm glad you found the publishing process to be good. That was my next question, was how did you find, so SUP, but also open access more generally, that day of going through a publishing process and thinking through that the fact that your work would be openly available? Was there any kind of additional factors that brought for you as you were stepping through the publishing process?
I think the ease of the publishing process and the speed of the peer review was very commendable. I think Ellen and I both have quite a bit of experience by this stage on the ups and downs of peer review. One of the major problems being the length of time that it takes. So we found the speed and of the peer review a very, very, very helpful in terms of our publishing deadlines, but also the critical engagement on the part of the peer reviewers was very good. And overall, I think the communication has been excellent.
That's really good to hear. I think that's something that we've observed as well with the aims of SUP, trying to be there for the academic community. We've had really great support from the academic community on our editorial board and peer reviewers. And I think that sense of trying to make the system work for everybody in it has been a kind of key ethos for SUP. That's all definitely good to hear. I wondered if either of you had any advice for colleagues who are thinking of publishing an open access book. It's something that people are still understanding the landscape, and the conversation like these I think really help people identify pros and cons and the sort of process around open access and demystify it a little bit. So any advice for colleagues that might be considering open access publishing?
Yeah, I think for me, open access would be the way to go in order to, as we have already said, to increase the reach. And I think it cascades to bring in other benefits, because most of the time when the work is open access, even you, the editors or the authors, you easily get invited to other events like book talks, launches, because people are engaging with the work in the first place. So I think that is the most critical element of open access that I would encourage authors and editors to pursue, that it gives everyone who is interested in that work the capability to access it and then to engage with it and then to engage with you later. So it's something that is very good. And I wanted also to add on what Jane said when he said our experience with the Scottish University Press was excellent. For me, 2 points stand out within the Scottish University Press. One is the constant communication that you get. You really don't nag anyone to ask about the progress. Most of the time, you are told where the stage at which your work is, which is quite commendable for publishers. Then the second one is the thorough editing that you actually get when you have sent in your work. You'll find that those who write from Africa, they use English as a second language. So there is bound to be some issues that are missed here and there. But I think your press actually engages with the editing process. So I think those ones stand out very much.
That's really helpful to hear and good. I think that speaks to the partnership model that we want to have and take with academic colleagues from library colleagues, and lots of folks behind the scenes, I must say, within SUP making all that happen and keeping us on track. I think the engagement piece you mentioned about publishing open access is really interesting as well. I think it does make a difference when we're having conversations like this, or if you're having specific events and discussing your work, the fact that people can then actually go away and, as you say, download and read the book. It does change the conversation. It means people often are coming into the conversation having had access to the book or are able to go away and do that immediately after an event. And that is different from when we're seeing academic colleagues speaking about a book that perhaps people aren't as able to engage with and engage in, therefore, in the conversation. That makes sense to me, that's something that you're seeing as a benefit too. Now, it's been really useful to chat about the open access and the process and the book, but I think we're probably keen to get into a conversation about the book itself and some of the themes and interesting aspects, because I think it is a book that does have an awful lot in it that we might not get through everything, but we'll pick out some interesting points to chat through. Gillian, I know that this was something that you were keen to pick up on as well, so I'll ask if you want to come in with questions here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so actually just to follow up or just to echo what Hannah said, thank you, so much for all that feedback. We haven't had this opportunity to speak before, so it's really helpful to hear about your experiences with SUP as well. But yeah, now I'm keen just to talk about the book and get into the content and the kind of starting off with just the broader thematic aspects. So I think what strikes me is the broad appeal of the book. There's so much there, so many kind of detailed case studies that are of interest of themselves. But the broader themes of the book, I think, take a challenging stance on what is a challenging subject. So there's at one point where you mentioned that you didn't want to undertake administrative research, that you were focused absolutely on calling the powerful to account. So having that, aim in mind and that kind of big purpose underlying this research, you do note that with that comes risks to the contributors. And also you point out that there are inherent difficulties in research and surveillance, given that it is shrouded in a culture of secrecy. So I did wonder in reading the book how these challenges manifested in your research, and were there, special measures or considerations that you had to make in order to take the research forward for that reason?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we faced was because we were relying to an extent on in-depth, semi-structured interviews for some of our information and documents as well, is so much of the information about the baseline of what is going on regarding surveillance capabilities in these Southern African countries is classified. So, we had to be careful about the documents we were using and the sources who provided us with the documents so as not to compromise anyone and to misuse legitimately classified information. We also faced difficulties with encouraging people to speak because there is a climate of fear. People are worried about whether they are already under surveillance and whether there would be repercussions from speaking to us in interviews. But at the same time, we found, and it was quite heartening, large numbers of people who were willing to overcome those fears and speak because they recognized the fact that not speaking out and becoming part of the public record about how these capabilities are being used and abused would, at the end of the day, be more harmful than perhaps taking short-term risks and speaking out. So we had a range of civil society actors, activists in social movements, investigative journalists who themselves had been either feared that they were under surveillance or had been told by sources inside the intelligence agencies that they were, in fact, under surveillance because of their activism or their investigative journalism, in other words, not for legitimate reasons. They were willing to come forward and to put the circumstances around that surveillance on the public record, and in the process of doing that, become part of the solution. Because what we're looking at in this book is an attempt to try and compensate for the deficiencies, some would say deliberately created deficiencies, in official oversight mechanisms, by creating what we could refer to as do-it-yourself oversight, where people use popular agency in order to monitor and review how these capabilities are being used by intelligence agencies. And we can only learn that by looking into the circumstances where individuals have been placed under surveillance, recording their experiences, trying to separate out legitimate from illegitimate surveillance, and starting to develop a model for what effective oversight to push back against illegitimate surveillance would look like. So we were encouraged by the commitment to the broader vision of what we were attempting to achieve.
Thank you. Alan, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, just one point maybe to say one of the manifestations of these challenges included the difficulties that we encountered to get the ethics clearance, as I think Jen has already pointed it out. But then I think it also became an exciting point of departure because we were able to then look at other possible sources of getting our information. And working in a context where everything is around intelligence is politicized was in itself a huge challenge.
And that challenge must have been extended given the reach of your research as well, working across 8 different countries, looking at different contexts, and also having to establish different networks then within each. So it is a really, it's been a huge undertaking.
This is in fact something to note going forward for politically sensitive research. I mean, I was funded by the British Academy on the basis that we were undertaking high-risk research. But at the same time, that created certain contradictions in the sense that we were also required to obtain ethics clearance for any data collection that involved human subjects in those 8 countries. But that in turn, I think, is based on a problematic assumption that needs to be unpacked, which is that ethics clearance is somehow some public good that is necessary in order to protect people's personal data. In certain circumstances, particularly semi-authoritarian and authoritarian circumstances, ethics clearance, even if it exists, and in some countries it didn't even exist in the social sciences. So we really struggled in a country like Mozambique for that reason. But in circumstances where it does exist, it can be used as a filtering mechanism in order to filter out critical research. So at some stage, we need to, engage with the assumptions behind why ethics clearance is necessary in particular countries and whether it's even desirable if it's going to be used effectively as a censorship tool.
It's really interesting. I think although these kind of issues are very much, you've kind of presented issues that are specific to the 8 countries involved, the themes there that you're touching on can be extended elsewhere, and I think that's very much, been a facet of your thinking in all of this. So thinking about that broader issue of the technological capacity for surveillance outpacing those governance structures, or even those governance structures maybe working against the purpose in the first place. I think so much of that resonates beyond the case studies that you've included and beyond those countries. Over the course of your research, or since you started, has your perspective on the global relevance of your work changed since you started back in January 2023?
For me, my perspective has not changed. It actually has been reinforced, because if I look at the work broadly, one thing that I'm convinced of is that the findings actually demonstrate the continued existence of surveillance, the continued existence of states that don't follow any laws when it comes to surveillance. So we are still supposed to dig more into this black box of surveillance, because what we only did in this book was to expose where these kind of surveillance activities are happening and to make a case of oversight, to make a case for oversight. But I think there is more happening, considering also that the trade in surveillance technologies is actually increasing by the day. So I think my conviction is the work, my view has not been changed, but rather reinforced, and I believe that there is need for expansion of this research going further.
I'd amplify Alan's point by saying that I think the major themes in the book are more relevant than ever before, because perhaps to explain, we chose to focus on intelligence-driven surveillance because, intelligence is one of the most secretive areas of the state, and often because of that, one of the most abused. And we're particularly concerned about how surveillance capabilities for national security purposes were being used and abused, because national security can become stretched like an elastic band in order to fit in all manner of social dissent and social ills that should otherwise be legitimately covered by basic democratic rights and freedoms. I think what we're seeing in the world today underscores the global relevance of the research, because we see a race to the bottom in terms of intelligence powers. Everything and nothing is about national security. So if we look at what's happening in the US, for instance, where trade and tariffs are becoming used and abused as a mechanism of national security, where national security has become an instrument of national competition, it's become less about maintaining global safety and security from identifiable threats. So I think that this race to the bottom in terms of intelligence powers, where intelligence has become about everything and nothing, I think legitimizes a situation where surveillance powers can be used for just about anything that political elites consider to be threatening. And this should concern us because increasingly we have Gen Z protests spreading around many parts of the world, including across Southern Africa. And we see surveillance technologies being more abused than used in order to put down and suppress legitimate political actors, for instance, the spreading Gen Z protests. And the global trade in surveillance technologies is global. It's a global problem. And the global north especially, and the global east are major contributors to the problem, in the sense that they are not looking at Southern African countries who remain clients of many of the manufacturers of these technologies. They are not looking at these countries and asking themselves whether basic democratic rights and freedoms exist in those countries, whether baseline controls of these powerful capabilities exist in those countries before exporting to those countries. So, the global north and the global east, countries like the US, UK, Israel, China, are deeply implicated in the very problem that we are exploring in this book. So whichever way we look at it, the issues that we're dealing with in this book are not simply Southern African focused. They have a global resonance.
Absolutely. And I think, the all-encompassing nature of what you've just described and of that surveillance leads to a situation where you note that people are living without reasonable expectation of privacy any longer, that we're just so used to being watched and monitored as we go about life. And one of the points that you come to at the end of the book is around informed digital citizenship as being a key factor in a route forward. It seems a massive task against the kind of backdrop of surveillance capabilities to combat this. Did your research suggest any way forward in terms of promoting or developing informed digital citizenship?
Yes, I think in parts of the chapters, because it was not really the overwhelming focus of the book, but I think in certain chapters of the book, people spoke about perhaps large-scale digital citizenship rights programs, because this will go a long way. And specifically in my chapter 10, one thing that I noticed in the context that I was researching the Zimbabwean context is that there are many non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. Actually, there is even an umbrella civil society organization called the Crisis Coalition of Zimbabwe. It brings together under one umbrella all these non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. But under that big umbrella, that huge tent, you rarely hear people speak about surveillance oversight, because they are worried about other issues that necessarily don't relate to surveillance. The cases of exposure that I treat that have happened in that country, for example, there was the case in 2021 of the vice president of the country, Kembo Mohade, who was secretly recorded, and then the recording was made public. But when these cases happen, people think, no, surveillance is an elite problem. It's not basically what you're worried about. So these are issues that make it hard for us to really prescribe methods or approaches. But they highlight the contradictions and the issues that we have to deal with, because it is hard to, of course, have one big digital citizenship program, because obviously the elites might not be interested in it. And in a context where citizens have very little power, it might not get off the ground. But when exposures like the surveillance of a vice president happen, you might think that maybe they will trigger a movement from below to say if the second most powerful person in a country of 18 million is surveilled, what happens to the Tom, Dick, and Jerry in the street? But it did not trigger that. Of course, people complained, people talked about it, but it remained anchored, contextualized around elite circles. So it was very difficult to really prescribe what can actually happen. Then it is also difficult to enlighten the public that what is happening is that surveillance is being weaponized because it targets specific individuals. People see this as abstract. It's like trying to explain to a person that I feel like this when I'm hungry. You can't really explain it, but you know it's happening somewhere. So those are some of the challenges that we have already highlighted. And the elite also, the other day, the problem that we have in having coming up with solutions is that the elite, who are the beneficiaries of surveillance, especially the illegal one, they have an advantage. There is a narrative that we have found in some cases that if you start talking about human rights in sub-Saharan Africa, then human rights is seen as a neo-colonial discourse. So if you start talking about surveillance and fencing off specific spaces as private, you are then said, no, but you are very much, it means you are working in cahoots with the former colonizers. So already that discourse itself nullifies any other effort that you might want to take as activism. So we were cognizant of these challenges as well.
I think one of the difficulties that public oversight actors faced in all the countries that we were looking at was precisely the problem that Alan touched on, which was surveillance and the defense of digital rights was often seen as being an elite issue, not a bread and butter issue. So what we did was we looked at positive examples where surveillance had in fact been turned into a bread and butter issue, or related to general conditions of oppression and exploitation that affected many, if not most people in a particular country. And we looked at popular campaigns that had actually taken an otherwise elite issue and related it to popular concerns and popular struggles so that it was mainstreamed in struggles that were already taking place in organized formations that already existed, from social movements that were dealing with housing or unemployment, for instance, to the churches. These turned out to be perhaps surprising, but at times decisive public oversight actors that could tilt the balance of power in terms of how surveillance was being used and change, in fact, state practices around how surveillance was being used, precisely because these actors were large and they exercised substantial social power. So we looked at positive examples in Mauritius, for instance, which was perhaps our most positive example, and South Africa, and also a positive example in the DRC that shared these characteristics, where activists had, in social movements, had mainstreamed the issue of surveillance overreach as being part and parcel, as being one manifestation of many other manifestations of oppression and exploitation in those countries. And that any struggle to make those social relations more just and equal inevitably had to include a component that was anti-surveillance in its character. So we saw this being done very successfully for a period of time in South Africa, for instance, where an organization called the Right to Know campaign brought together a range of specialist NGOs, investigative journalists, and popular social movements around a common struggle for information rights. And that in turn was expanded to include an anti-surveillance struggle as well. And that exercised considerable social power to the point where the intelligence agencies in the country were forced to change how they were conducting surveillance. We saw something similar, and perhaps most significantly for the UK at the moment, in Mauritius, where there was a popular mass campaign, a mass struggle against a digital ID system that the government attempted to introduce from 2014 onwards, which would have resulted in the establishment of a centralized biometric database against which individuals' biometric minutiae would be compared in order to confirm their identities. And there were many fears about this in Mauritius, fears around violations of privacy, digital security fears, and also the struggle drew on historic memories in Mauritius of how people were forced to carry IDs on the sugar plantations. These were indentured laborers, slaves, and activists tapped into those historic memories in order to say that we are going back to that earlier era that we thought we'd left behind, of being forced to identify ourselves in ways that we didn't feel comfortable with. And this resulted in a major victory in Mauritius, where the centralized biometric database was actually dismantled after a court order. So we had a groundswell approach where opposition built up in existing community structures, village community structures, for instance, village committees, the trade union movement, which still remains very strong in Mauritius because it has a long history of organizing on the sugar plantations. And all of this came together with the technical part of society and investigative journalists, and they all collaborated also with lawyers as well, and some opposition politicians. And all of this pressure eventually culminated in a victory. So that is what a good campaign against unwarranted surveillance looks like. And I think we can all learn lessons, including in the UK, maybe especially in the UK, from what happened in Mauritius.
I think that is a fascinating example, and it kind of brings in that idea of who are citizens? What do we mean by citizen action when we see all of these groups coming together, and just seeing how important that networked and the connectivity is there, and bringing people together to affect that change together. So it's really interesting, and as you say, definitely lessons that can be learned here in the UK as well. I'm thinking back to one of your previous points, Jane, where you had mentioned around private companies, the suppliers of this technology, and thinking about that broader role of public-private partnerships and surveillance, and how that then contributes to accountability challenges. The flip side of that, though, is that there are positive potentials for the use of private sector actors. How do you mobilise that private sector involvement for good?
One major challenge actually is that we are increasingly going into a situation where the private is actually the public and the public is the private. So the lines are blurred. We are not very sure now who represents the private and who represents the public. I can cite an example that is actually also in the book of CloudWalk. This is a Chinese private company. And in 2019, they signed an agreement with the government of Zimbabwe. And the agreement was actually about supplying surveillance technologies. But then this company was backed by state-backed grants. So this is now, it seems that the public is supporting the private. Yet this company is also, despite the fact that it is now being backed by state grants and loans, is still gearing for profit. So the main issue here is the lines are being blurred because the private seems to be profiteering from public funds in order to secure these technologies. And also the fact that these private actors are driven by nothing, as I have already said, but profit. So it is not easy to mobilize the private sector involvement for the good. Then there is also the added disadvantage that in between, there has been a creation of a very effective middleman culture by the private sector. So they have enlisted middlemen that actually mediate between them and the government. Mm-hmm. So if you go to Zimbabwe, you'll be told that a specific company is supplying cameras, public cameras, but then it works in cahoots with the specific politicians who are also taking a cut. So when you work in that context, mobilizing a private sector is very difficult. But what I might think is that in countries where the judiciaries are still a bit independent, litigation is one way to go, so that you hold these suppliers accountable for the technologies that they are supplying. But I'm not sure, I'm very skeptical whether this would be possible in a context where the judiciary is captured by the elite themselves, and yet they are the very same people benefiting from these technologies.
I think that, as Alan was saying, the private sector's primary motivation is profit. And I think the way that one can deal with private sector collusion in unlawful and unwarranted surveillance is to hit them in their pockets. And we saw this actually happening, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, where there was a heightened global sensitization about the importance of privacy on communication networks and a growing move towards pushing for greater encryption. So now what was the exception to the rule before the Snowden revelations, which was, encryption on networks, has now almost become the rule, where if one communicates over networks that are not end-to-end encrypted, for instance, one feels vulnerable, and often people choose messaging services based on whether they're end-to-end encrypted. So I think that's been a fundamental global shift that has taken place, including in Southern Africa, and that has placed pressure on the private sector to offer goods and services that are more privacy sensitive and that incorporate privacy by design principles. And one would be surprised how concerned, even beyond the profit motive, people are inside the major communication service providers about the potential for privacy violations. So, for instance, I have one interview with a confidential source in a communication service provider in South Africa who spoke about his own anxieties about how the main surveillance law in South Africa, RICA, was being misused far beyond the need to investigate and prosecute serious crimes. Those are actually extremely important sources of information to tap into. If you can find a private sector actor with conscience who's not just simply thinking about the bottom line, even if he or she's thinking about the bottom line, they may still end up being forced into being privacy sensitive because of the demands of the broader citizenry about the need for privacy enhancing technologies. Even if there are people inside there who have some notion, some semblance of public interest, because they too are, go home and are citizens in the ordinary world, tapping into those people as sources of information about what's going on the inside and the private sector state interface, in how the private sector is often forced into, coerced into undertaking surveillance that even they themselves feel uncomfortable with. That's enormously valuable information. And you can actually, if you're persistent, dig it out of those private sector actors that are perhaps more publicly minded.
Well, that's really interesting. So just by being out with the state, by that one step of remove, you're increasing the possibility of people being more receptive to speaking out, or you're creating that step of remove from the decision-making process, which I suppose then opens up possibilities. So that's an interesting thought, certainly.
Leads on that, it's that idea of change, isn't it? As you're saying, that as public perceptions change and shift over time, then that has that impact as well on people within companies and their mix of opinions.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. Coming towards this I think we've actually, in some of the questions, we've already talked through some of the key recommendations or suggestions that you've observed from the case studies, but the research ends as a conclusion, a theoretical proposition on the conditions needed for effective oversight. Can you just outline that theoretical proposition that you arrived at for us?
You can go, Jane.
Sure. Well, I think we tried to come up with a theoretical proposition that could hopefully be relevant across time and space, not just be relevant to Southern Africa. So, we had concluded that public oversight is an important form of democratic oversight that needs its recognition, it needs its place in the sun. If one looks at the existing intelligence literature, for instance, it's practically non-existent when you look at the book chapters on oversight and how it's practiced. So we recognize the fact that public oversight was extremely important and at times decisive in changing how surveillance was practiced in these particular contexts. But in order for public oversight actors to be effective, certain conditions needed to apply. So we recognized the fact that there were what we could describe as anchor public oversight actors, that by virtue of the fact that they had existing public influence and access to resources and were fairly well organized, could anchor any pushback against surveillance overreach. And those often were investigative journalists and non-governmental organizations. But it was not enough for those anchor oversight actors to act on their own. Firstly, they would need to be able to demonstrate that any instance of surveillance overreach impacted on an affected interest. So in other words, they had to show that a broader political community, preferably at national level, was affected by that particular infraction in order to get traction in a particular country. So for instance, if one took investigative journalists, the campaigns that didn't work were ones that focused on investigative journalists as an individual. But if you took unlawful surveillance of an investigative journalist because of their investigative journalism, and you generalized it and related it to a broader interest that a political community shared, which may be related to a broader struggle against oppression that many, many people felt, then you were more able to galvanize the necessary action to bring about positive change. But you needed to do even more than demonstrate an affected interest. You also needed to adopt a groundswell approach and encourage your anchor oversight actors to work with grassroots organizations whose primary motivations may not be necessarily related to surveillance overreach. But if you work in clever ways, using a mobilizing strategy that mainstreams concerns about surveillance abuses in existing social movements that exercise social power, and that as a result, political and economic elites take seriously and cannot not afford to listen to, then you are more likely to succeed in your public oversight. So those were some of the observations that we made that started to form the elements of a theoretical proposition that we developed in the book.
What strikes me there is that kind of need for coordination. That's quite an intensive process. And in terms of bringing all of those strands together, from your grassroots to your NGOs to your kind of groups of journalists, do you have any sense of how that could be achieved in a more widespread basis, or is it very much context-based? Is it related to the political situation? Is it related to the particular groups that exist within one space? Or are there any sort of overarching lessons that we can take from that?
I think this can be achieved across even different communal contexts, like Jane has explained. All that is needed is that maybe the way they will differ from one context to another, because obviously circumstances do differ. But the overall starting point, the structures of action are, as Jane has explained them. The most important thing is trying to bring together a myriad of actors here in order to achieve public oversight. These actors have to be brought together. But as Jane has already said, this also has its own problems, because these actors have different interests and they have different levels of power. And these levels of power also differ from one context to another. But one point that I wanted to make in reflecting around about this is that it would be more productive if actors treat surveillance as a social justice issue. I think that can actually form a rallying point for almost everyone who is interested in a fair oversight mechanism. I want to treat surveillance as a process that marginalizes other people and a process that actually is oppressive. And once we agree that oversight can lead to the dismantling of specific structures of oppression that are within surveillance, I think it can form the basis around which we can mobilize everyone for oversight, for effective public oversight.
I think also a general lesson that can be learned that can be applicable elsewhere is when you organize a campaign around surveillance overreach, think sideways and be creative. Don't just simply think about, well, what are the digital rights groups who are interested in this, and organize a coalition of them. Because while they may have the technical expertise to understand what is often a technically complex area, they may not necessarily have the social power that's necessary in order to make the official actors take them seriously and do something about the things that they are complaining about. So for that, you need to map the social actors in your space that perhaps are surprising, that you would never ordinarily associate with digital rights, but that are taken seriously when they stand up and they raise an issue, and work with them and make those issues relevant to their base. Don't emphasize organizing separately, but use the organizing resources, the rich history and legacies and traditions of mass organizing. Use them in order to galvanize some kind of response to these problems, because you're likely to be more successful that way. And to relate that to the UK situation, we had in 2015, 2016, a controversy around the Investigatory Powers Bill that threatened to legalize extremely broad surveillance powers on at times very nebulous grounds. And there was an opposition to it. But the opposition seemed to adopt quite a specific character because it was quite rooted in digital rights organizations, pro-privacy organizations, specialist litigation, public interest law clinics, who came together in order to mount a campaign under the rubric of Don't Spy on Us. Now, they weren't particularly successful. They managed to change some of the worst features of the bill, but they weren't particularly successful in changing the overall trajectory of the bill, which was far more surveillance and privacy violating orientated. If you counterpose that to the approach that has been adopted around the revelations around spy cops, where, since the 1970s onwards, there has been information coming to light of undercover agents being infiltrated into the trade union movement, the environmental movement, and other social movements in order to spy on them from within, forming relations with women, lying about who they are, and this has formed the basis of a very protected commission of inquiry. But I would say that the organizing around the spy cops revelations has been much more impactful and successful because it's adopted more of a groundswell approach. It's actually mobilized outrage, as it should, in these broader social movements that still exercise considerable social power, maybe less social power than they did in the pre-Thatcher era, but still exercise social power. And they organized campaigns through them. And as a result of that, I think just about everyone knows about the fact that the police overreached themselves when it came to undercover surveillance in social movements. I think probably far more people know about that set of issues than know about the Investigatory Powers Bill and the threats therein. So there's a very practical example of how one can take this theoretical proposition and apply it. And in fact, it's already been applied in reality, in the sense that people have recognized that this is the way to go when it comes to effective mobilizing around what may otherwise be considered elite issues.
Absolutely, and I think that's a brilliant example. We're reading the book The Spy Cops issue was something that came to mind quite a lot, because I think in terms of changing perception about what is really happening, I think in the UK we do kind of lean towards that liberal democratic, watchful oversight definition that you kind of mentioned in the book of oversight, and maybe not really believing that. I think before Spy Cops, most people would have thought that that wasn't possible, that couldn't happen, that the state would never do that. Certainly that felt like the opinion, but that really brought that to the fore, and I think made that real in people's lives here. So I think that's a kind of great example that speaks to us here in the UK, certainly. And that actually brings me to the end of that kind of tranche of questions that we had around the thematic aspects. I'm now just going to move on, and there are a few questions just about the overall process.
I wondered particularly what challenges you thought there were working across countries of different political contexts in terms of process as you're working through this.
Yeah, there's quite significant challenges, and I think we have already highlighted one of them, that the most significant was the question of ethics. Like in specific contexts, there were no structures at all where you could apply for ethics. And then we are bringing together different actors here, even though the subject was oversight. The questions on the ground differed from one context to another. What kind of oversight would Mozambique prefer, and what were the main issues around oversight in that country? That definitely differed from, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Though we tried, of course, to create questions that basically gave us almost uniform answers, but we cannot run away from the fact that the cases were different. That was a challenge, but that was also the most interesting part of the research, because it made us to reflect more broadly, like what then can oversight look like in the region. So I think it was both. Then we also had the challenge of timelines. Because we were empirically driven, we did not get data at the same time. And it was actually challenging to coordinate this kind of research, because somebody got the data at another time, somebody got it in another time of their own. Spaces were different. But for some reason, this worked very much for us. And I think going forward, we really have learned how to coordinate such a massive and complicated project and produce the results that you want. Producing an exciting book, we really got that experience. You might find very few groups of scholars that have had the experience that we had together as a team.
It has been a massively challenging project, and it's been really insightful to hear all the different aspects of it today as you've been speaking through. One bit I noticed, and Jane spoke about this earlier, about working with different actors within companies, investigative journalists, different people who are sort of non-academic contributors, if you like. Often research projects can be quite involved with other academic communities. Would you have advice for other researchers from your experiences of working with non-academic contributors to the work?
It comes with its own challenges, but it's enormously enriching. So, for instance, in the case of Mozambique, our academic author there, who's also, a very prominent civil society actor, he's the director of the Mozambican chapter of the Media Institute for Southern Africa. So he has a, very big footprint, if you like, in Mozambique. But he collaborated with an investigative journalist in the country in order to put together a chapter that was both theoretically informed and empirically grounded. And I think that in this line of research, applying investigative journalism skills to academic research is extremely important, because you need to learn the tricky skills of ferreting out information, of finding sources, of cultivating your sources, of keeping them happy, of making the information flow. All those skills that I think are the bread and butter of investigative journalism. I think academics may find them quite difficult, but through collaboration, I think they can learn from one another. And I think what investigative journalists can learn from academics, and hopefully this happened in the collaboration, was starting to recognize underlying patterns and processes and laws of motion that can start moving us towards theorizing events. So it encourages journalists to start also, predicting the likely course of events once they understand the theoretical underpinnings of the events that they're reporting on.
Thanks, Jane, and speaks to true collaboration when you are learning from each other in that way and evolving processes in both directions. We said at the beginning, I covered in this introduction, that this work emerged partly through the British Academy Global Professorship. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what role that played in the research. I think you had identified some sort of high-risk research that was being supported.
Yes, well, the professorship program specifically states that it funds cutting-edge and high-risk research. And I think given that the research fitted the bill, it appeared to be something that the British Academy was very happy to support, which was a relief for us because it's often difficult to find funding to conduct research in this kind of area, because often funders are worried about, their own relations with the private sector and with governments and what have you. So we were very happy that the British Academy recognized the importance of the research, were independently minded enough to support the research on its merits, were open to supporting research that was risky, and they've stood by us, but at the same time they've also stood back. They've been very hands-off, but when we've needed them, they've been there. They've been extremely supportive. So I think the fact that they were willing to provide us with fairly substantial funding over a 4-year period and then allow us to run with the process, I think has been absolutely what we needed.
That's helpful. I think that will be helpful for others to understand what that can look like and how that's worked in practice. And you said that it's 4 years. I think, does it run to the end of 2026? So I think perhaps then just the next phase of your research sort of leading up to the end of that, and where you think this goes next, would be helpful for people to hear about.
We are in the process of discussing that and planning for that in the group. But it seems more than likely that we would like to extend the research into focusing on AI for national security and how there are no guardrails whatsoever, to a frightening extent, when it comes to using AI for national security purposes. There really is nothing. Even when it comes to the supposed state of the art, when it comes to AI regulation, which is the EU AI Act, there's a national security exemption in there. The OECD, the African Union, wherever we look at the major multilateral documents that have been produced, they are silent on what guardrails should be put in place when it comes to using AI in national security functions. And this is frightening, because the potential for AI to be used and abused and turbocharge, in fact, the kinds of abuses that we've documented in our book are real and pressing. And we don't see nearly enough work taking place on these issues. So, for instance, trying to re-envision norms and standards for how AI should be used in national security functions, and what will happen particularly to more vulnerable countries that are more peripheral to the major AI centers. So, for instance, countries in Southern Africa who are net importers and consumers of AI technologies trained on models that are foreign. So there are particular and unique dangers that are posed to Southern African countries by this free-for-all when it comes to AI for national security. So we're thinking of moving into that space and looking at it a bit more closely.
Jane, I think you could have launched us into another hour's worth of conversation as we begin to think about that. So we might need to wait for you both to write that next book and have that conversation. But it's certainly a really interesting direction of travel, and I can see how that builds on what you've been uncovering and bringing into a wider conversation through this book around democratizing spy watching. Unfortunately, I'm going to draw us to a close, which I loathe to do, but it's been a really great conversation. I have some thank yous to do. Firstly, to Gillian for co-hosting this and asking such excellent questions, and other colleagues who facilitated this event and supported publishing processes behind the scenes. Thank you, of course, to everybody watching. You're part of the conversation, but particular thanks to our Fireside guests today, Jane and Alan, for sharing their insights and experiences and engaging us in such an interesting conversation. Now, the book itself, Democratising Spy Watching, Public Oversight of Intelligence-Driven Surveillance in Southern Africa, is available open access from the SUP website. That's sup.ac.uk. So that means that you can read it online or download it as a PDF or EPUB for book readers for free. You can also purchase a paperback or hard copy, if that's your preference, from all normal retailers, and from for any library colleagues watching, from our standard vendor options as well. And we were just chatting before we started about how nice this book looks in hardback as well. It's a particularly nice one. Other books are openly available from sup.ac.uk, so please do take a look at those as well. And we're open to submissions from authors. There's some great resources on the website to answer questions and guide through the submission process. We now accept submissions from across the UK and have a new programme for open access textbooks as well. If anybody thinks this might be relevant to their writing or academic work, then I hope they get in touch. And we have opportunities for peer reviewers and academic supporters of the press as well. Now, this today, though, has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I was particularly struck by the dichotomy of the lack of ethics in technology companies in the global north and east that are providing the technology, compared with then conversations you had on the constraints on ethics as a potentially censoring factor when you're trying to research then elements of that. The idea as well you introduced that surveillance is not abstract, but actually has potential to be sort of individual and weaponized. And you asked us who the beneficiaries of surveillance are, and how do we hold these conversations in the context of human rights without making it an elite issue? And how could social power be galvanized? These are really, really thought-provoking and relevant to so many areas, as you did for us, linking it to public life, but academic interest as well. So as we're closing today, I think we've learned a lot more about the types of investigations that support questions of public oversight, the potential it has to bring about change, the challenges, though, in this type of research in a politicized context, but how pursuing those questions through investigations with a range of actors with ethical interests further supports the aim of oversight. And I think this idea of compensating for deficiencies in oversight to monitor and review the use of surveillance technology advances all of our understandings of what can be done there. I do hope that everybody here has enjoyed the conversation, but everybody watching has as well, and it's given some time in people's day to consider some different perspectives around technology and progress and accountability, and that everybody will download and share the book. We've seen such great engagement and reach with the book already since its publication day, and I hope to see this conversation extend further and further. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.